Well, reports today from Taiwanese intelligence that Australia's security alliance between the UK and US is a major threat to China's regional agenda. To talk more on this, North Asia correspondent for The Australian, Mr Glasgow, joins me now. Good afternoon to you, Will.
Hello from Taipei, Julie. How are you?
I'm well. Will, your exclusive in today's Australian reads Australia's nuclear submarine deal has set off a very big alarm in China. What has been the reaction? Tell us.
Well, look, publicly the reaction began quite muted out of Beijing, but it's got louder and louder, and the issue's been elevated all the way to the top to President Xi, who in the last few months has become the public voice pushing back on this from Beijing, although, as is often the way from in these kind of campaigns from China, in a coded way. So Xi, in an address to the ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia last month, he didn't mention AUKUS, but he spoke about nuclear proliferation in Southeast Asia, and he spoke about the danger of alliances, and he spoke about what he calls small circles. All of that is code for the US alliance network, and the talk about nuclear proliferation is all about the AUKUS submarine deal, which of course is not actually for nuclear weapon armed submarines, but for nuclear powered submarines. But that's a part of the strategy China's taking, trying to blunt this exercise from Australia, the UK and the US. But what was very interesting from one thing the exclusive interview I did with him, which is on the front of The Australian today, it's for who he is, right? He chairs the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Intelligence Committee in the Taiwanese Parliament. He's the government representative. He's been on there since President Tsai Ing-wen was elected in 2016. So he's got an important job to oversee Taiwan's military, which is so important, of course, as it's under routine threats from China. But he also oversees the intelligence agencies. And while he couldn't go into, of course, how the Taiwanese got this information, how they got this, what he could tell me very clearly was that the AUKUS agreement has run a big alarm in Beijing. The reason for that is a bit complicated in some ways, very simple in others. I mean, the complicated thing is when you get into the military strategy, right? So, I mean, how effective really is 8 submarines from Australia that are more than a decade away from getting in the water? You get military analysts analysing that. But the key point, the key signal, if you told me, is the signal that sends to Beijing that the US alliance network in the region is not going away. And that's a key strategic goal that China wants. Quite the opposite is happening, and AUKUS is such a dramatic example of that. It's 3 countries already with an existing security relationship, deep trust between all 3, doing the very opposite to what China wants, which is rather than Australia reducing its security relationship with the US, doing exactly the opposite. And in a really alarming development for Beijing, the UK, which is not in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, it's got assets and interests there, but not a country in the region, has actually signed up to this decades-long agreement, which is, of course, aimed at trying to blunt Beijing's aggression.
Well, China's foreign ministry has attacked the AUKUS security agreement in racial terms, calling it an Anglo-Saxon clique driven by white supremacy. What has the local reaction been to that?
Well, look, China uses that language, that kind of racial language quite a bit in its propaganda. You won't hear Xi Jinping say that in a speech. He certainly didn't say that to ASEAN nations, but they do like to characterize these things. They're just looking for techniques to blunt those lines from, blunt this exercise or make it unpopular within the region. But because as one thing you told me, I mean, this is a Taiwanese man. He's saying, a senior member of the Taiwanese government, this is not a question of race. This is about common interests. It's about security interests in the region. And so, I mean, his advice to the Australian government is see that for what it is, a technique to try to drum up some support internationally, but much more than that, an exercise in domestic propaganda, speaking back to China. Of course, the party leadership has tried to explain to the Chinese people, why is this happening? I mean, why is it that Australia felt so urgent about its security situation that it ripped up a contract with another partner, France, that it was able to get something that no other country for more than 50 years, not since the UK got this technology from the US, has there been shared transfer of nuclear-powered submarines. This is a big, significant development. The Chinese then have to explain why. Now, they're not saying, they're not going to tell people in China, well, the reason is we've freaked out the Indo-Pacific region and they're shoring up alliances to try to push back and constrain our military aggression. So they go with the Anglo-Saxon clique.
And keeping in mind these nuclear-powered subs are more than a decade away.
Well, that's right, they are. Now, also, though, keep in mind, and Beijing's aware of this, AUKUS is more than just submarines deal. I mean, that's the centerpiece, and it's huge. I mean, it's an enormous contract, more than $80 billion. It's going to take decades and decades to happen. As I said, this transfer of technology hasn't happened for more than half a century, so it's enormous. But immediately what AUKUS does is shore up intense cooperation between the US, the UK and Australia on technology, on artificial intelligence, on industries of the future and technologies of the future. And that's where this long game with China is going to be waged, as far as you can see, for decades and decades into the future. And what also really alarms Beijing about AUKUS is that part of the agreement can be expanded. You're not going to see other countries coming on to get involved in that submarine contract, but you could very well see Japan, eventually France, see all sorts of other partners, South Korea, joining that technology sharing part of AUKUS. And that's creating a set of relationships and shoring up alliances that is very worrying to Beijing. Now, in many ways, Beijing's the author of those alliances. It's creating the alarm that AUKUS is responding to, that those other agreements are responding to. But here we are.
All right, we do have to leave it there. Will Glasgow from The Australian, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Of course, your exclusive is on the front of today's Australian. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.